Hari Om. Om Namah Shivaya. Oftentimes, friends and colleagues ask questions about what's the advantage of doing the puja, the prayers. So I thought, why not just talk about this today and share some ideas about the science behind ritual, attention, habit, embodiment, and well-being associated with the puja that we are asked or we are advised to do from our childhood. There's a value to it. And all the viewpoints that I'm sharing are my personal viewpoints and do not reflect that of my employers or anybody else. They're my own personal opinions. So forgive me if I commit any error from the spiritual standpoint or from the scientific standpoint, and do initiate a dialogue, because my goal is essentially to initiate a dialogue and learn in the process, because I'm a learner. There's a very famous book, Nitya Pūjā Prakash, published by Gita Press. So my opinion, content, the reference point is that book. So let's get started. Nitya Pūjā, regular worship performed in domestic or other recurring settings, is simultaneously a religious act, an inherited discipline, a sensory motor sequence, a temporal outline, a routine that's done in a temporal fashion, and a mode of relationship. These dimensions make it a promising subject for the interdisciplinary inquiry, but also create a risk of reductionism. A laboratory description of attention, repetition, respiration, or habit cannot exhaust what a practitioner understands as devotion, obligation, hospitality, remembrance, or encounter with the sacred. Conversely, the religious significance of a practice does not by itself establish psychological, physiological, educational, or clinical effects. This perspective proposes a layered framework. Today's perspective proposes a layered framework that holds these domains apart while allowing disciplined translation among them. It distinguishes textual and historical accounts, practitioner meanings and lived variation, the observable architecture of a puja episode, the candidate cognitive, affective, social, and physiological processes and outcomes that can be evaluated without treating neuroscience as an arbiter of the religious truth. Nitya Pūjā is analyzed as a configurable practice that may combine stable cues, preparation, ordered action, visual and auditory attention, gesture, recitation, offering emotional salience, and closure. The framework that I am presenting, it generates research programs based on ethnographic task analysis, ecological observation, prospective novice cohorts, micro-longitudinal assessment, mechanistically matched comparators, and component-sensitive experiments. It emphasizes variation across traditions, households, practitioners, life stages, and degrees of expertise, distinguishes ritual efficacy within a tradition from empirically measured outcomes, and rejects universal claims of benefits. Gāyatrī mantra recitation is presented as one possible nested case study rather than a proxy for Nitya Pūjā as a whole. The goal is a culturally responsible science of recurring religious practice that preserves meanings, supports falsifiable inquiry, and treats null or heterogeneous findings as informative. So let's get started. Recurring religious practices occupy a large part of human life, but remain difficult to study. They are repeated enough to invite analysis of learning, habit, attention, and regulation, yet their significance often depends upon histories, relationships, ontologies, and commitments that are not captured by those constructs. Nitya Pūjā Our daily worship offers an especially useful case. In different settings, regular worship may include preparation of a place and body, invocation, visual attention to an image or symbol, gesture, offerings, recitation, circumambulation, contemplation, distribution of prasad, and formal closure. The sequence, theology, frequency, duration, and degree of elaboration vary substantially. The adjective nitya or nitya can indicate regularity or obligation, but daily practice should not be assumed from the label alone, nor should domestic worship be treated as a miniature, uniform version of temple ritual. Historical prescriptions, contemporary manuals, institutional teaching, family transmission, and individual improvisation may produce different practical forms. The first scientific responsibility is therefore description. Who performs what, when, where, and with whom, using which objects and words, under which account of why it matters. Today's episode, this lecture argues that Nitya Pūjā can be studied productively when interpretation precedes measurement and when measurement does not claim to settle theology. The proposal builds upon ritual studies, anthropology of religion, cognitive science, habit research, embodied cognition, contemplative science, and cultural neuroscience. Its contribution is not a claim that puja is a therapy. It is a framework for generating answerable questions from a complex living practice. So Nitya Pūjā, objects of study and interpretive boundaries. Puja is frequently described through the idiom of honoring or attending to a deity as one would an esteemed guest. This formulation is illuminating but incomplete. Traditions differ in their understandings of divine presence, image, offering, agency, grace, obligation, and participation. The material environment, lamp, water, flowers, food, fragrance, bell, image, text, seat, and sacred space is not merely a package of sensory stimuli. For practitioners, these elements may be offerings, presences, inheritances, or media of relationship. An interdisciplinary account should distinguish at least 4 kinds of statement. A normative statement describes what a text, teacher, or lineage says ought to occur. An ethnographic statement describes what particular people actually do and how they understand it. A mechanistic hypothesis proposes measurable processes that may occur during or around the practice. An outcome claim concerns changes associated with participation. None substitutes for another. A textual prescription does not demonstrate population prevalence. Observed regularity does not establish obligation. Physiological change does not validate a deity claim, and subjective religious significance is not invalidated by a null laboratory result. The unit of analysis also matters. Puja can refer to a full sequence of family of practices, an episode embedded in household life, or a component such as arati or mantra repetition. Research must specify the unit rather than treating the name of a tradition as an interventional label. So to conduct analytical decomposition of Nitya Pūjā episode, let's think about the following items. What is the context and intention? That's number 1. Then what does the preparation and transition involve? That's the number 2, the next event in this chain of events. Ordered action. Then recitation and attention. and even focused attention. Offering and relation is the next, and then the closure and return. So you close it and you come back to it. So the elements and their order vary. Empirical work must document the actual practice under study. That is critical. So let's talk about a layered interdisciplinary model. So first comes meaning and relation. It involves devotion, obligation, identity, and sacred presence. Then comes practice architecture, sequence, objects, gesture, sound, and timing. Then comes candidate processes, which involves attention, memory, habit, affect, interoception, behavioral and physiological study involves that. And then the outcomes, the experience, the adherence, functioning, well-being. So translation across levels does not imply that religious meaning is reducible to cognitive or physiological mechanisms. So the proposed model begins, this layered interdisciplinary model begins with meaning and relation. Textual scholarship, history, theology, and practitioner testimony clarify concepts such as nitya, seva, bhakti, darshana, sankalpa, prasad, and shraddha in context. Translation should preserve ambiguity where traditions disagree. The second layer is practice architecture. Sequence, timing, objects, spatial organization, bodily orientation, speech, sound, sensory channels, participation, and permissible variation. Ethnographic observations and task analysis belong here. The third layer contains candidate processes. Stable cues may support initiation of a routine. Ordered actions may recruit sequence memory. Recitation may coordinate speech, auditory monitoring, memory, and respiration. Visual fixation and gesture may organize attention. Offering may recruit valuation and relational emotion, and closure may mark a transition between sacred and ordinary activity. These are hypotheses, not explanation of the religious practice as a whole. The fourth layer concerns outcomes. Immediate outcomes may include felt absorption, calm, arousal, connection, obligation fulfilled, or interruption of rumination. Immediate outcomes may include felt absorption, calm, arousal, connection, obligation fulfilled, or interruption of rumination. Long-term outcomes could include adherence, attentional habits, affect regulation, family continuity, identity, social support, conflict burden, or changes in well-being. Changes in well-being. Effects may be beneficial, neutral, mixed, or adverse, and may vary with autonomy, belief, social context, time pressure, health, and ritual competence. So let's talk about the candidate research domains. Let's talk about the candidate research domains. Attention and cognitive control. The first is attention and cognitive control. A puja sequence can require maintaining an action plan while coordinating objects, recitation, timing, and correction. Experts may rely on chunked sequences rather than greater domain-generated capacity. Experiments should distinguish improved performance on trained sequence from broad claims of enhanced attention. Eye tracking, behavioral probes, and experience sampling could examine allocation of attention without assuming that stillness equals engagement. Next, habit, prospective memory, and temporal organization. So regular practices are often anchored to time, place, bathing, meal, sunrise, and other events. Habit theory predicts that stable context can facilitate initiation, while prospective memory research asks how intentions are retrieved at the appropriate moment. Yet, obligation, devotion, and family expectation may be stronger determinants than automaticity. Daily diaries and passive time-stamped measures used only with consent could separate contextual regularity from the subjective commitment. Embodied and material cognition. So posture, gesture, gaze, touch, sound, fragrance, flame, food, and spatial arrangement contribute to how the episode unfolds. Embodied cognition approaches can examine how action and environment scaffold memory and attention. Material objects must not be treated as interchangeable laboratory props without first determining their meanings and acceptable handling. Next is affect, meaning, and regulation. Affect, meaning, and regulation. Repetition and predictability may reduce uncertainty for some practitioners. Devotion, gratitude, reverence, grief, or concern may also be central. Ritual can intensify as well as soothe emotion. Studies should measure positive and negative affect, perceived obligation, spiritual struggle, and context rather than selecting only outcomes likely to show benefit. Social transmission and identity. Even solitary domestic worship may be learned from relatives or teachers and oriented toward family or community. Participation can transmit language, narratives, sensory repertoires, gendered roles, and household responsibilities. These processes call for family and life course research, not only individual psychophysiology. Then the last is physiology and respiration. Physiology and respiration. Vocal recitation, paced action, posture, and emotional state may alter breathing and autonomic measures during a session. Such changes are state markers, not automatic evidence of health benefit. Respiratory rate, speech production, posture, and expectancy should be measured together with appropriate resting and active controls. Let's talk about Gāyatrī. Gāyatrī mantra recitation as a nested case study. Gāyatrī mantra recitation can occur within broader daily disciplines, but it should not be used as a universal stand-in for Nitya pūjā. It's a textual history, eligibility, initiation, pronunciation, metra, devotional interpretation, and relationship to Sandhya practices require specialist characterization, because there's a whole process how the Sandhya Vandan is done. And people may be doing it differently depending on their own cult. So that needs a specialist level characterization. Contemporary practice is also diverse. Recitation may be vocal, whispered, or mental, counted or uncounted, solitary or collective, embedded in a longer sequence, or performed independently. A credible experimental program would decompose the practice. Comparators might include the same text spoken at an unconstrained rate, acoustically matched non-semantic syllables, a familiar secular passage, silent repetition, paced breathing without words, passive listening, and quiet rest. These conditions could also help estimate contributions of respiration, articulation, auditory feedback, semantic familiarity, repetition, expectation, and devotional meaning. No single control removes every difference. A small prospective study has reported improvements after Gāyatrī practice. This is from Samajdar in 2020. But such findings should be treated as preliminary when they use convenience samples, weak allocation procedures, no active control, multiple outcomes, or inadequate blinding. The appropriate next step is not a stronger benefit claim, but pre-registered replication with transparent methods, credible comparators, adverse event monitoring, and estimates of heterogeneity. So let's talk about the research designs. Phase 1, collaborative characterization. That's key. Researchers, practitioners, ritual specialists, Sanskrit scholars, anthropologists, and community representatives should develop a practice ontology. Video-assisted interviews can identify sequence boundaries, optional components, error correction, meanings, and acceptable measurement. Sampling must include variation rather than a single institution presented as a normative. Next is phase 2, involves ecological observation. Repeated observation in natural settings can quantify duration, timing, interruption, sequence stability, participation, and within-person variation. Short pre-post measures may assess state change, but repeated sampling is essential because one ceremonial session may not represent routine practice. Phase 3 is prospective cohorts. Novice people, new learners, beginning a voluntary practice can be assessed before training and followed over time. Comparison group should match motivation, social contact, time commitment, instructor attention, and expectancy where possible. Discontinuation and non-adherence are outcomes, not merely missing data. Phase 4 is component-sensitive experiments. Brief, ethically acceptable components can be manipulated after their cultural meaning has been documented. Within-person crossover designs may be efficient for immediate outcomes. Investigators should avoid dismantling components that practitioners regard as inappropriate to isolate. Then comes the phase 5, which is generalization and mechanism. So findings should be tested beyond the originating population. If a sequence learning effect is proposed, it should predict performance in another structured task. If paced respiration explains a physiological change, respiration matched condition should reduce the apparent specificity of the ritual component. Competing explanations should be pre-registered. It should be pre-registered. So let's talk about evidence domains and permissible inference. So first is textual or normative domain. And here the primary evidence is texts, commentaries, manuals, and teachers. The permissible inference in this context is what a source or lineage prescribes or interprets. And what is not established is population prevalence or biological effect. When we deal with ethnographic domain, primary evidence is observation, interviews, and material documentation. And permissible inference would be what identified practitioners do and report. Behavioral domain, pre-registered tasks and ecological measures are the primary evidence, and permissible inference would be association or experimental effect on specified measures. What is not established in this and the previous domain is universality across Hindu tradition and religious efficacy or broad cognitive enhancement. Physiological or neural domain. So here the primary evidence for that, we have respiration, autonomic measures, EEG, imaging. Permissible inference would be state or trait difference under defined design. What would not be established is causation from cross-sectional difference or theological truth. We cannot establish that. Then comes the longitudinal or causal domain. Primary evidence would come from prospective cohorts, randomized components. Permissible inference would be change attributable within the stated assumptions, and what is not established is generalization beyond population and components studied. Then let's talk about the priority research program. So the first stage is characterization, then comes ecology, then comes development, then comes components, and then finally generalization. Each stage has a corresponding question, design, and essential safeguard. Characterization. So what counts as the practice here? Design would be collaborative, textual, ethnographic, and task analysis. An essential safeguard would be do not present one form as universal. Do not present one form as universal. At the stage of ecology, the question is how stable is the presence within the persons and settings? How stable is the practice within persons and settings? And design would be repeated naturalistic observation and diary sampling. An essential safeguard here is to keep in mind that protect sacred private settings. Protect the sacred private settings. Third is, sorry, I got a phone call, so that got me distracted for a second. But so we're talking about the priority research program. The second stage is ecology, and the question here is how stable is the practice within persons and settings? And the design would include repeated naturalistic observation and diary sampling. And the essential safeguard here is protect sacred private settings. Third stage is development. And here the question is, what changes after voluntary initiation? Design would include prospective novice cohort with matched comparators. And the essential safeguard is measured dropout and self-selection. Next stage is components. And the question is, which immediate processes explain an effect? The design is within person, active control, component sensitive studies. An essential safeguard here would be culturally acceptable manipulations only. And final stage is that of generalization. Final stage in this priority research program should be that of generalization. The question is, does the proposed mechanism being tested transfer? And the design would be independent replication and non-ritual transfer tasks. An essential safeguard here would be pre-register competing predictions. Pre-register the competing predictions. So we spoke about the 5 phases in the research design, and let's talk about measurement and causal inference. Exposure cannot be represented adequately by a yes or no item. Minimum descriptors include tradition or lineage when relevant, exact components, frequency, duration, age at onset, cumulative years, recent adherence, mode of learning, autonomy, household participation, language competence, perceived meaning, and changes over the life course. Researchers should separately measure belief, identity, and practice. Major threats to inference include self-selection, socioeconomic and educational confounding, family environment, sleep and health behaviors, social desirability, expectancy, survivorship, and reverse causation. Experienced practitioners may differ from non-practitioners long before training. Cross-sectional brain or behavioral differences therefore cannot establish training effects. Outcomes should be selected for reliability and relevance. Neuroimaging is warranted only when a specific mechanistic question cannot be answered more directly. Behavioral performance, respiratory measures, ambulatory physiology, qualitative accounts, ecological momentary assessment, and adherence data may often be more informative. Qualitative and quantitative findings should be integrated without forcing narrative testimony into numerical validation role. Let's talk about ethics, governance, and responsible communication. Religious practice research involves more than ordinary participant protection. Consent must address recording of sacred spaces, images, voices, ritual knowledge, and potentially restricted material. Researchers should establish who may authorize access, which data may be shared, how quotations will be reviewed, and whether open data expectations conflict with community governance or participant privacy. Recruitment must avoid pressure from teachers, family members, institutions, or investigators. Studies should be open to null, mixed, and adverse findings. Participants who experience guilt, distress, conflict, fatigue, respiratory discomfort, or unwanted spiritual experiences should have appropriate routes for reporting and withdrawal. Communication should avoid both romanticization and debunking. Terms such as ancient technology, proven by neuroscience, and scientifically validated spirituality collapse distinct domains of evidence. Equally, laboratory non-confirmation of a proposed psychological effect does not adjudicate the religious worth of worship. Community partnership should improve the accuracy of description, not confer veto power over legitimate negative results. So let's talk more about it. Let's discuss it. Nitya Pūjā is scientifically interesting because it organizes action across timescales. Within minutes, it coordinates objects, gestures, speech, attention, and emotion. Across days, it creates recurrence and temporal structure. Across years, it may participate in learning, identity, family memory, and life course change. No single discipline can describe all these levels. The interdisciplinary opportunity is therefore methodological. Ritual studies can prevent decontextualization. Textual scholarship can clarify historical and normative claims. Anthropology can document lived variation. The psychology can formulate constructs and competing explanations. Physiology and neuroscience can measure selected processes, and ethics and community governance can shape responsible access. The value of this collaboration depends on preserving the boundary between translation and reduction. This framework also has comparative potential. Recurring worship, prayer, chanting, and household ritual occur across religious traditions. General principles should be tested comparatively rather than attributed prematurely to Hindu practice. Conversely, meaningful differences in theology, materiality, language, and social organization should not be erased in the search for universals. So, Nitya Pūjā should be approached as a living religious practice before it is approached as an intervention. Its recurring structure makes it suitable for research on attention, sequence learning, habit, embodiment, affect, social transmission, and temporal organization, but those constructs capture only selected features of the practice. A responsible research program begins with textual and ethnographic characterization, specifies the unit of analysis, measures variation, uses mechanistically informative comparators, and treats causal claims conservatively. Gāyatrī recitation offers one tractable nested case, especially for separating recitation, respiration, repetition, meaning, and expectancy. It should not be isolated from its history and practice context without explanation, nor should preliminary findings be promoted as proof of broad benefit. The broader objective is neither to naturalize theology nor to spiritualize neuroscience. It is to create an interdisciplinary science capable of studying meaningful human practices without stripping them of meaning. And that's the goal. That's the whole agenda. That lets there be at least some discussion. That's key. So let's conclude. And as we conclude, I would like to leave you with one central thought. Nitya Pūjā is much more than sequence of ritual actions. Nitya pūjā is much more than sequence of ritual actions. It may bring together attention, memory, speech, breathing, gesture, emotion, discipline, family inheritance, devotion, and a recurring relationship with the sacred. But precisely because it is so rich and multidimensional, it must be studied with both intellectual curiosity and humility. It must be studied. And the importance of Nitya pūjā should be brought out in the community. And if there is a value in doing it, why don't we use it as a social intervention? We want to do research? Yes, we should do to prove what it implies, but we should have an interest in this topic. So we should not begin by declaring that puja has already been proved by neuroscience. At the same time, we should not assume that religious practice or spiritual practice in Indian tradition lies beyond serious academic investigation. No. The appropriate path lies between these two extremes. We must first understand what practitioners actually do. What do they do when they're doing the Nitya Pūjā? We need to understand that. What that practice means within their tradition and how it varies among families and communities and which parts of it can be studied scientifically. Only then should we ask whether particular components such as recitation, structured attention, breathing, gesture, repetition, offering, or daily regularity are associated with measurable cognitive, emotional, social, and physiological effects. Even then, scientific findings would not determine whether a religious belief is true or whether worship is spiritually meaningful. Neuroscience can examine selected processes occurring during a practice. It cannot become the judge of theology or the spirituality, Hindu tradition. No, it cannot become the judge. Likewise, the sacred significance of practice cannot by itself establish a clinical or biological benefit. Therefore, the goal of this work is neither to reduce puja to brain activity nor to use scientific language to validate faith. The goal is to create a responsible interdisciplinary conversation, one in which Sanskrit scholars, practitioners, historians, anthropologists, psychologists, physicians, and neuroscientists can learn from one another. Gāyatrī recitation may provide one focused starting point for such research, but it represents only one component within a much wider and more diverse landscape of Nitya Pūjā. Future studies must remain sensitive to tradition, variation, consent, context, and the possibility of beneficial, neutral, mixed, or even adverse findings. Ultimately, Nitya Pūjā should first be approached as a living religious practice and only then as a possible subject of scientific investigation. If we can preserve its meaning while asking clear and testable questions, we may develop a science that studies important human practices without stripping them of what makes them meaningful. I hope this presentation encourages scholars from Indian knowledge system, Sanskrit University, Sanskrit studies, religious studies, psychology, medicine, neurology, neuroscience to help develop this research program collaboratively. I would especially welcome your thoughts. Which component of Nitya Pūjā should be studied first? Should we begin with Gāyatrī recitation? The complete sequence of domestic puja, attention during darshana, ritual regularity, or the transmission of these practices across generations? Please share your reflections in the comments. If you are a scholar, practitioner, student, or a researcher interested in contributing to this work, I would be happy to hear from you through IV Pandit, ivpandit.com. Thank you for listening. If you found this interdisciplinary exploration valuable, please share the video and subscribe to IV Pandit. Together, let us study India's knowledge, traditions with Shraddha, reverence, Jigyasa, curiosity, and Vivek, discernment. Namaskar.